Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here tonight and to share some thoughts with you. I'd like to especially thank the Minister and his colleague, and Kaya and Raya, for your presentations about ESD and sustainability in Estonia. Being a person from a great distance was quite important for me to learn a little bit of context. I really do look forward to attending as many sessions as I can get to over the next couple of days, because there's so many exciting innovations that are described in the program booklet. But it seems as if once we choose to go to one block where there's 4 or 5 on a topic, it might be hard to escape to other ones. So if I do sort of catch you over coffee or lunch to interrogate you about the paper I missed, please forgive me, but I'm really here to learn as much as I can. You're going to find as I move into my presentation that I'm going to be using some of the same concepts that Kaya and Raya used. In fact, it might even be 2 slides, Kaya, I've got, that you used. Now, how is that for, what were those words we were using? Transpersonal communication? Or intraplanetary communication with a synergy of ideas. You know, I suspect if I came from New Zealand or Antarctica, I might have travelled further to get here. Australia, where I live in Melbourne, is on the 150th meridian. And so it's not quite the opposite side of the world from Tallinn, but it certainly feels like it, and it's only nerves that are keeping me awake from my jet lag. And Ilga has travelled to Australia before and knows what a terrible trip that it is. But it's really quite an honour to be able to be here and to share some ideas that the conference organisers asked me to do from that distant perspective. To present more of a global perspective as opposed to a local or national perspective on sustainable development and on education for sustainable development. And you'll find that I will, like Kaya, introduce a lot of social and economic and political ideas into the discussion of the natural environment that we have as our base. You know, we're living in a world of no, it's not moving. Where should I point? Up here? Okay, to where? The first one worked. To here? Thank you. Sorry about that. You know, we live in a world of many crises, social, economic, environmental, and especially ethical. We still don't have that fairer, less troubled and more peaceful world that we were promised with the end of the Cold War. And we are pressing hard up against some very, very important planetary boundaries. And in addition, war and conflict seem to be a constant, and global poverty, natural disasters and tragedies always seem to be with us. Yet, if you believe the statistics from the United Nations, the world is actually fairer, less troubled, and more sustainable than it has been for the last several decades. And we saw an indication of that in Kay's presentation of many of the improved conditions in Estonia today. But we must never forget the exceptions. But on the whole, the severest impacts of poverty and the number and the duration of conflicts in the world are actually decreasing. This is actually a result of the human capacity for change, our ability to learn, our ability to adapt. We're able to trace the causes and effects of our actions. We're able to reflect on these from different ethical perspectives and then to apply our knowledge and values in seeking to address many of the problems we face. This is how Education for Sustainable Development is helping us to learn our way out of the sustainability crisis we are facing. Working towards Millennium Development Goals, the process of the last 3 or 4 years of developing new post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals has taught us that living a good life involves more than economic growth and money, as funny as that sounds. Living a good life has got very, very important social, cultural, health and environmental dimensions. For most of the last century, progress was mostly measured through the lens of economic growth or GDP. Most of us now realise that that is a narrow point of view. Many of the bankers even realise it is a narrow point of view. We're increasingly learning that it was an unwise thing to do. We've come to see that GDP provides only a limited view of what true wealth is. And indeed, as you can see from the slide, we've learnt that the capitalist system can't even provide the services or the products that every single person on earth needs every day of the week. I wonder why. However, we really do as a human species love new ideas, and we're struggling to build an economy suited to a carbon-constrained future. We're seeking to develop some form of economy where clean and decent work can be provided as a way out of poverty and a better quality of life for everyone. The more we try to do this, the more we learn that human society is striving to learn its way to a sustainable future. But it always seems to be the case of one step forward and 2 back, and then another one forward and a few more back, then a big leap forward. But compared to a decade ago, we can be confident and we can be optimistic that progress is being made. Very often in our study of environmental topics, we tend to get trapped into a problem focus. I remember when I first started teaching about environmental issues and development issues when I was a high school geography teacher. My head of department said to me, "John, when are you going to teach some happy geography?" And I'm quite pleased, as I've done reading in recent years, to realise that there are reasons to be happy. When you think about it, we've got a stronger and growing emphasis upon human rights and democracy in many countries, particularly in the global south. Anti-corruption campaigns are bearing fruit. I'm so pleased to have read that the European Union is taking action to ensure that Google and Apple and Microsoft will one day even pay tax on the profits they make and in the countries where they make them. Now, that would be progress. The rate of new HIV infections, as we saw earlier, are slowing down, and infectious diseases are declining through global improvements in sanitation and water supply. And in most parts of the world, particularly the poorest of countries, universal primary education is now giving way to a focus on universalising junior secondary education. Education for Sustainable Development has played an important role in all of these improvements. It may not have gone under that name, but the learnings that have occurred both in the formal school and university system and the social learning that has occurred through non-formal education are very, very important in helping the progress towards sustainability that we have made. The question then becomes, though, is how big a role has education for sustainable development made in helping us move forward? Well, it's always hard to quantify the good things of life. The things that make us human are much more qualitative than quantitative. And when you think that the world is so diverse and sustainable development and education for sustainable development have to be locally relevant and culturally appropriate, it's very, very hard to actually say how big a role education for sustainable development has played in the progress that we've seen in recent years. However, we can take heart from Arian Wold's and his team's evaluation of the just completed decade of education for sustainable development. It shows that in all countries, progress in providing a national and local and institutional structures for education has been a major outcome of the last 10 years. Nevertheless, the pace of learning for sustainability on a global scale is far too slow. In many ways, the continued dominance of economic thinking by governments and by business is actually perpetuating unsustainable development. And it's also impeding our use of the learnings that we've already achieved. Often it's a case of having to learn and relearn as we make our journey towards sustainability. One of the problems, for example, is that we talk about a green economy, but there's no real change. If the green in green economy simply means replacing brown products with greener substitutes and rates of consumption go on as they are. Applying the lessons of sustainable development that we have learnt really does require political commitment. And why it was so pleasing to see the Minister here this evening. It also requires the capacity for us to think in much longer time frames than we're used to. This is especially so when we think about climate change and applying the precautionary principle to long-term action on carbon pollution. A special point to note from that global perspective is that the world's ecological crisis runs parallel with a great number of social and economic problems caused by poverty. Environmental problems interact with poverty and other problems and actually reinforce them. Most Western leaders still fail to recognise our historical responsibility for the root causes of climate change. And many of the poorest countries of the world remain the most exposed and the most at risk of climate change, despite them making no contribution to the carbon and other greenhouse gases that were placed in the atmosphere 50, 70 and up to 100 years ago. Yet they are the ones who are having the least say in discussions leading up to the Paris climate change talks later in the year. A key need, I think, for all of us is the ability to learn ways in which environmental risk and poverty can be overcome by sustaining those life support systems that human livelihoods and our well-being depend upon. Social learning of this kind is really important if we're going to increase resilience and we're going to empower people to shape their own living conditions and the living conditions of future generations. Gaining the capacity to shape the future is an important goal of education for sustainable development. And it's especially important for people like us in the global middle class to learn ways of living and working and, yes, consuming that reduce the extent and the impacts of our ecological footprints. Thus, we are on an exciting journey, a journey in time that we can call the sustainability transition. This term had its origins in a similar phrase from a book written in 1944 by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation. Polanyi's book explained how the market economy evolved in the 19th century to become today's dominant economic system. But it was and it remains a system that ignores systems theory and a system that sees the economy totally separate from ecology and society. Someone once called this the Mickey Mouse version of sustainable development. The term Great Transition is a more recent one, and it sees the economy as a wholly owned subsidiary of society and of nature. And the economy and society are bounded by planetary limits, or what Donella Meadows and her Club of Rome team called the limits to growth. And I was quite taken with Raya's focus towards the end of her talk on the importance of love. You might recall that in 1972, the book Limits to Growth was published. In 1992, imagine how much better computers were then when they ran the models than it was in 1972. So they re-ran the Limits to Growth models in 1992 and found that many of the assumptions remained true, that we were approaching limits, but it was possible to turn back. And the final chapter of the 1992 edition of Limits to Growth was called Learning and Loving Our Way Forward. So thank you for reminding me of that. This term, Great Transformation, the sustainability transition, started to become popular when a group of scientists from around the world who called themselves the Global Scenario Group realised that the future wasn't something that was preordained by the past. The future just won't be an extrapolation of what's gone before us. Rather, the future will be a matter of human choice. And compared to the scenarios that they called conventional worlds, that rather horrible one they called barbarism, they had one scenario that they called the Great Transition. It's the one at the bottom. And they urge us to, as a society, global society, to choose the Great Transition as the pathway to reverse those historical mistakes we've made in the past. The Great Transition embeds the economy in social relationships and builds upon the values of sustainability and poses a values-led future that can in fact guide a paradigm shift in thinking about development. And in fact, the Great Transition is sometimes called a new paradigm. How's the size of that print from the back of the room? Perhaps we needed field glasses from the bird watchers. in order to be able to read it. But I was impressed when I came across this passage from a European Union sustainability research project, which imagined what Europe might be like in 2050. And for those at the back, I'm going to read it out. How would a sustainable Europe look in 2050? We can envisage a vastly more efficient economy where energy and materials are used to maximum effect. Shops will no longer sell disposable goods and waste mountains will be a thing of the past. Responding to climate change, buildings will produce their own energy needs. Innovation in science and technology will no longer be driven by profit alone, and they'll be inspired by the one planet economy challenge and become everyday practice in all branches of industry. There is an equal and opposite agenda on the consumption side. Consumers demand only low-impact products and services and share cars or equipment where possible. They actively prefer products which are adaptable, long-lived and designed for remanufacture. The principle of stewardship ensures that resources are shared according to need rather than squandered in conspicuous consumption. 200 years after giving rise to the Industrial Revolution, the EU pointed the way towards an industrial evolution. Sounds good, doesn't it? But how realistic is it? It's difficult to imagine, perhaps in our more cynical moments, many big businesses and their allies in some governments and international institutions being big supporters of such a steady state sharing economy. Transitions of this kind do not come overnight. The European Union project from which this slide comes envisages the great transition as the work of a whole generation. And our choice as educators in 2015 is to decide how keen we are to make it happen in our generation. Or will we leave it to our students and our children to make it happen in what could be much more difficult circumstances for them in the future? But yet, change is happening as we've seen. We've all heard of sustainable business practices, green loans, clean production, industrial ecology, biomimicry, decoupling, life cycle analysis, decarbonation, dematerialisation, green economy, green growth, and so on. These are ideas that actually you find in business textbooks these days. And here is an editorial from a business magazine, which is talking about green growth, as they described it and defined it, as the only way forward for the future. However, I'm reminded of a statement by UNESCO during the decade of education for sustainable development. The important part's in blue. But it says sustainable development can't be achieved by technological solutions or by political regulation or financial instruments alone. Achieving sustainable development requires a change in the way we think and act, and consequently, a transition to sustainable lifestyles. Only education and learning at all levels and in all social contexts can bring about this critical change. I wonder if, like me, you believe that the great transition requires a different sort of education from what the Greening of Growth Brigade are offering. I think it also requires a different sort of leadership from government, from business, and from us as educators. And I'd like for all of us to think ourselves of educators as leaders or agents of change. And when I start using words like leadership, you think, he's finally getting to the actual topic of the talk. But you might have noticed from the first slide that I've done some rejigging of the colours and the size of letters, because as I go forward and actually now come to the topic of the talk about this integral approach to learning the leadership skills needed for us as educators in the sustainability transition, I'm reminded that a lot of what I'm going to talk about now was talked about in much more effective and practical ways by Rhea when she was describing approaches to education for sustainable development in Estonia. What I'd like to do, though, for the next little while is talk about what an integral approach might be and how integral education and integral leadership are interrelated and how both of them are needed for us to play a part in the sustainability transition. Integral thinking realises that all aspects of our lives involve both an inner journey and an outer journey. A well-rounded, educated person is able to integrate the head and the heart of the inner journey with the hands of action of the outer journey. A teacher committed to a role in the great transition works on both her inner personal and her outer professional growth as a leader of change towards sustainability. Integral thinking is based on the ideas of a man called Ken Wilber. And the word integral is similar to holistic. And of course, holistic and holism are quite common when we talk about sustainability to describe the systems-based way of looking at the world. And so Wilber said that the word integral means comprehensive, inclusive, embracing, and that integral approaches to any field include taking as many perspectives and styles and methodologies as possible within a coherent view of the topic. Central to integral thinking is the concept of quadrants. The quadrants in integral thinking are 4 different ways or 4 different lenses for looking at the complexity of the world. The words on the outside of the slide show that the 4-quadrant framework sees reality as having both exterior and interior aspects, the outer and the inner journey, as well as individual and group aspects. And the north-south and the east-west lines represent a continua from the individual to the collective and from the interior to the exterior. And their intersection of these 2 lines is what gives rise to the 4 quadrants as different ways of seeing and thinking and knowing the world, with no one being any more important than the other, and in fact all needing to be integrated into an integral view of the environment. Let's just look at the 4 quadrants. Starting in the top left, there's the individual interior quadrant, which represents the I of the individual. And this is the psychology of our individual experiences and our perceptions, and often I think the spiritual dimensions of life that we have. In the top right, there's the individual exterior, which is the way we act in the world. And we, of course, know that very often the way we act in the world is not what we would like to do. And we can only ever understand how we or other people act and behave in the world by seeking to bring that interior and exterior together. In the bottom left, we've got the collective interior quadrant, which is the we of culture, sociology, shared values, politics, economics, and shared experiences. it's very often not just the material world, but also the symbolic world in which we live. And then finally, there's the collective exterior in the bottom right, which is the reality, the physical reality of natural systems and the material implications of social and economic structures. And so as we start to understand, why do I act the way I do when it's not really what I want to do in the environment? Why do I have a gap between my inner thoughts and hopes and values and what I do? To understand that, we then need to be looking at those social and economic structures which pose constraints and limits and steer us in particular directions, often against our will. Now, that's one of perhaps the briefest summaries of integral theory ever been presented. But what's more important for us, though, is what are the implications of viewing this systemic, integrated view of the world for us in education for sustainable development? And that's what I'd like to talk about next. And two ways in which I think it's important. First of all, when we come to teach any topic, we can use the 4 quadrants as a way of structuring the inquiry. And those who do go to Wolfgang's workshop on the mission, we will learn the way in which we will plan our own mission to ensure the biosphere, which is obviously quadrant 4, bottom right, remains sustainable. Let's think of a topic, say, like water. If we're working in the I domain, we're talking about our memories and experiences of water and the way that we've come to understand water as important to the things that we enjoy and need in life. We could also look in quadrant 2 about the external world of how we act in relation to water, our use of water for bathing and for washing, and how conservation-minded we are when we do that. We can look at culture to see the relationship between water and different societies and the way water has different meanings in different societies and different rituals and social practices about its collection and use. And finally, of course, there's the 4th quadrant, which is the planetary limits of water cycles and river ecosystems. No one lens, no one quadrant provides a complete way of understanding water by itself. Thus, to understand water or to practice sustainable water management, we have to look at the interconnectedness of the perspectives represented by the 4 quadrants. I think at this point we can all start to see the close connections between systems thinking, sustainability thinking, and integral thinking, and why I think integral thinking provides a useful philosophy for sustainability and education for sustainability. Integral thinking is also provides a transformational approach to learning. It's transformative in 2 ways, for both personal transformation and through transformation of the parts of the world we are studying with our students. It's suggested from integral educators that it's possible to structure our teaching of any topic, say water, as a 3-step approach, beginning with our own personal and group experiences of water, observing, sensing, and investigating, and then stepping back to reflect, to allow inner knowing to emerge, and new visions of how water might be used to develop. And then looking at alternative ways of achieving the vision, selecting and justifying courses of action, and then evaluating what changes take place. And I think in that transformational learning model from integral learning, those familiar with the IVAC approach to inquiry, that came from, I think, the action competence people in Denmark. They talk about education for sustainability having a four-step process of investigation, developing visions, taking action, and then evaluating for change. And I'm sure that the integral education people never had any connection at all with the action competence people, but they do come together in this model for learning and structuring teaching units in education for sustainability. However, and this is the second way in which it's important, integral theory is more than an interdisciplinary approach or a method of teaching sustainability. It also recognises that personal growth is an important outcome of the learning that we experience. So in the evaluating for change is not just evaluating change in the outer world, but evaluating changes in ourselves as individuals and as small groups and as a class, as we consider the effects of learning for sustainability. And it's here, I think, that integral thinking ties education and leadership together. Because some of the learning outcomes or the transformations that can take place through such an approach to learning for sustainability are listed there as, new ways of seeing the world. And people in integral thinking often talk about such a process of change as being the U journey in the shape of that symbol they use. But certainly the first transformation we can experience is a transformation of our understanding of the way we see and experience and understand, seeing things through new eyes. Also, we can get transformed relationships between each other, better empathy, social skills, and the ability and the willingness to work together in the future. And there can, of course, then be transformed intentions. How are we going to live and act in the world as a result of our learning for sustainability? And once we have those transformed intentions and transformed understanding, it's possible that the way we act in the world, either individually or collectively, might be changed as well. So it's in that way that integral theory can be a really important aspect of personal transformation and social transformation. It almost reminds me of Friere's notion of conscientisation and literacy. Friere defined literacy by a play on the English word, W-O-R-D. He said literacy was not so much a matter of learning to read and write the word, but learning to read and write the world. Putting an L in it. And in those sort of learning outcomes there of transformation is very similar, I think, to that Freirean process. And what it can do is that it can help us as educators to explore and develop the multiple dimensions of our own being. It can help us understand who we are as physical beings, to understand our emotional intelligence, to understand our thinking skills and our way of thinking, help us understand our interrelationships and personal skills better, and also our spiritual wisdom. And these growths in our physical being, our emotional intelligence, our cognitive skills, our interpersonal relationships, and our spirituality, I think are the outcomes of a good education for sustainable development. So the choice then becomes, what sort of leader, educator for the sustainability transition do we want to be? You know, that if we choose not to be, as I said earlier, it'll make things only harder for the next generation. I don't think there are any simple answers. I certainly don't have any. Just as we're on a sustainability journey, we're also on that personal inner and outer journey as we explore the ways we want to teach and how we teach and towards what ends. So rather than conclude with a set of steps of things that we all must do, I'd like to conclude with an invitation and a question. How's that? The invitation is just to think about integral thinking a little bit more. Dr. Google is wonderful. And there are lots of wonderful readings that are freely available, and quite a lot of really exciting teaching and learning materials available. And you wouldn't be surprised to find what they actually do is they try to integrate deep ecology-based approaches with social ecology approaches. And so, you know, on the train one day on your smartphone, do have a little explore and find out a little bit more about integral thinking. You'll find that Ken Wilber, who developed it, isn't a particularly nice person. But that, you know, we often judge others, you know, by their motives and ourselves by our actions. Judge integral thinking by the ideas rather than the people who developed it. And now, the question. I've presented, I think, a quite instrumental view of education. And I think it's probably more instrumental than we're probably used to in Western countries. Certainly in Australia, we've been told that education should be neutral, education should be objective. And in fact, there's one famous environmental educator from Canada who said that he doesn't even want his children to be educated for sustainable development because it'd be indoctrination. Yet part of the thinking that we came to develop during the United Nations decade of education for sustainable development was that, yes, education does have its own intrinsic value. A quality education is important in its own right. However, this needs to be supplemented by a much more instrumental focus on, for example, education for poverty reduction, education for rural transformation, education for skills for employability in a carbon-constrained future, climate change education, and education for disaster risk reduction, education for gender equality. Are we happy with this more instrumental view of the role that's being posed for us in education for sustainable development? More importantly, is it possible to teach for sustainable development, for the sustainability transition, in a way that is both committed and professionally ethical? And that is the challenge. I actually believe we can, and I offer integral education as a helpful way of thinking about how we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm sure there are questions. Yes, in the center here.
I have a question about market economy, because you said that market economy is something which is really bad, but there were systems which were not based on market economy, and unfortunately these systems were totalitarian systems. So how would you introduce, what do you think, is there any alternative really for market economy? So another thing is about teaching about objectivity, and you said last about indoctrination. I think the difference is, for example, when we feel that there is bad environmental impact of pollution, this is something objective. When we think about other things like some more issues connected with economy, there are things which were not experimentally proven, so, or well proven negatively, so that's something else, and that would be ideology.
Yeah, two very hard questions. I think the second one's the easier one. The first question, though, of is there an alternative feasible to market economy, the answer is there must be. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it must be a state economy or a centrally planned economy. There is a role for the state in adjudicating and setting the boundaries within which the market economy operates. Very often advocates of the market economy talk about free trade. Rather, what's needed are rules and regulations about fair trade. And what I would think is that one of the biggest challenges facing political leaders today is to be able to operate in a world where many of the largest companies have more power, more wealth, and much more knowledge even than what governments themselves had. And so the shared experience of governments in developing a global economic system of a balanced market economy, and the way the EU is, and countries such as South Korea are leading the world in developing and providing incentives and overcoming the barriers to moving towards a greening of industry, I think are important ways forward in that. Do you want me to have a go at answering the question, is it possible to teach in a professionally ethical way with commitment? Are there any issues upon which teachers can't be neutral? Issues of race, racism in the classroom? Should teachers be neutral over that?
That's how you understand this.
Issues of gender bias, issues of disability. Can the teacher be neutral? So, and I think on those sort of three issues, I don't think I could be, you know. Racism is wrong. You know, it's an ethical imperative. But how can I actually teach towards increased racial understanding and international understanding, or teach towards more conservation mindedness in a way which is sort of devoid of my imposing my own points of view on the vulnerable minds of children? It's, yeah, I think, the great moral question for teachers in the world today. And I'm quite glad I teach in university now rather than a high school, because you can generate the discussion a lot more and draw upon a greater knowledge base. But I do think that inquiry-based approaches to learning, experiential approaches to learning, and working through the 4 quadrants does give an opportunity for students to see the diversity of perspectives that are available and to make judgments themselves. We can steer them, but I suspect if a 12-year-old makes a decision that we might not like, they after all still only 12-year-olds. And there's a great opportunity for them as they grow up to maybe see the light. I hope I sort of addressed some of those points for you, because there were 2 very, very hard questions first up.
Yes, there. We'll have it up first and then...
Hello, John.
Hi, Daniela.
How are you? My question helps, I guess, to elaborate a little bit more on those core themes that you've just introduced, which I think are quite critical to the concept of education for sustainable development. You talk about instrumentalism. I would rather use the word transformative, in the sense that if education is used for a certain purpose, it's to actually unleash the potential of our communities and our societies to determine a future, as against to our communities reproducing the inequalities that exist. So would you say that education for sustainable development is much more transformative than it is instrumentalist?
I think that that gives me a way out, which I thank you. But if I was being honest with myself, I would still want to have to be able to say, how can I make decisions and structure learning experiences so that students can plan transformations themselves, as opposed to my having particular transformations in mind. And it comes back, I think, to English is a horrible language, as you all know. Consider yourselves lucky, I'm stuck with the only one. But words such as belief, opinion, attitude, and values in English are often used interchangeably, whereas in other languages they have quite distinct meanings. And so when we, in English, sort of start thinking about the place of opinions and beliefs and attitudes and values in the classroom, we do then need to think about different pedagogical approaches that are more appropriate to different meanings of those terms.
You had a question?
I would have a more practical questions.
Oh, thank you.
You made us hungry when showing us the quadrant model, which means there's a promise to make a complex story easier, simpler, more simple to understand. But you did not show us any psychometric proofs. You know, in ESD there were so many models not delivering what they promised. Is it another model, or do you have proof for it?
It's a model that I'm experimenting with. It's a model that I'm learning about and thinking about as I use it in my own work. And it's a model that I found particularly useful because of its capacity to bring things together for students in a integrated way. And that when they approach any topic, then they can know they need to look at it through those 4 lenses. Whereas often I've found, working off systems theory, the language loses undergraduates. While we might want to teach through systems thinking and teach systems thinking, there are ways of teaching systems thinking with younger children. I found that just this particular sort of use of quadrants to be a good structure for helping people to think about the world in a systemic way and to see the relationships between them. So it may turn out to be another false god, but let's all experiment and play together with it.
Please raise your hand if you had a question.
I am Ea Blomqvist from Åbo Academy University in Finland, and I happily agree with you that life is not neutral or subjective. I think we must admit that there is no objectiveness. It's a dynamic process, but it's not something that it's not a model. It's real life, and where we end up depends on our own choices. So thank you for a lovely introduction.
Thank you.
Yes, in here, and then Sue.
Thank you. I am Essi Arnio-Linnanvuori from the University of Helsinki, Finland. And I also wanted to comment on the ultimate question that you gave us to think about. I have read those articles by the Canadian Bob Chickling, and they wake me up at night. I am writing a PhD at the moment, and I've made teacher interviews, and my observation has been that the teachers, at least in Finland, are confused about this issue, if they can teach values or not, if they have to be neutral or if they have to be not. For example, some teachers feel that they have to be neutral about the climate debate. So they can't take a stance in the debate whether climate change exists or not, which is actually not a question of values at all. It's on a different field. On the other hand, some of these same teachers say that they feel that it's their duty to say that they are for gay marriage, because this is something that they have to express for the children, and they have to be supportive for the students that might be gay. And these same people think that they can't say anything for climate change, even though they themselves believe that climate change exists. And then on some other issue, they think that they don't have to be neutral. So I think there's a lot of confusion about this issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Marek, next year's conference, we'll have a session on values education strategies. I know we have a number in the program, because it's a thing that we're all thinking about. But there are a number of very good conceptual tools for thinking about values education that are worth exploring, and we can chat about some, if you like, later, that might be useful. Because that was in my PhD too.
If I may also comment, it's exactly what you said about the difference between beliefs, opinions, and so on, where words come into play, and it affects our values so strongly, the words we use. There was a question in the back, Sue.
I'm just wondering whether or not you have any personal experiences as a teacher of how you integrate the emotional feeling intelligence of the I quadrant using a predominantly intellectual structure.
Thank you. I wasn't a very good teacher at helping children pass exams. But I would like to think that when I was a high school teacher, I was much better at helping them think about themselves and their own views and what they wanted to do in the world. And so I can say I've probably had more experiences of teaching for the I than for the it's. And there are really sort of, wonderful, sort of sharing nature with children, earth education, deep ecology-based approaches. And I've also found, as I seek to integrate a social ecology, social justice perspective into teaching, that teaching for intercultural understanding and for a sense of justice are really important as well. And I found strategies from community interviews, community action projects through to poetry to be wonderful ways of doing that. I've generally found that what you've got to teach for the exam, you can probably do in the last 6 weeks before the exams are due.
Any other? Yeah. Please.
Seems to be the favorite topic to ask about subjectivity and objectivity and being value neutral. What is your personal opinion in the discussion when we have it in the field of research and science in the context of sustainability or whatever word we use? Do we need moral science, a science with value? Because you know the discussion what we have had in that field that we have raised generations of especially nature scientists who are so
narrow
and objective.
Yeah.
So what are your personal, non-correct politically answer?
Okay. I've got a story to tell in answer to that. And it's a story in which some English swear words come in, so I've got to restructure how I tell the story. Coming from the part of the world where I do, the landscape I love and where I get my personal nourishment is a rainforest. Often, when I'm feeling depressed, I've got to really resist the temptation for retail therapy and head to nature therapy. And to find a quiet place in a rainforest where nature is so majestic around you and the temperature drops, the humidity is higher, the birds are deafening, is something really wonderful for me. And I remember saying to a very, very famous rainforest ecologist about this experience. This man was in his 80s, and he was the explorer of the Amazon botany, and he actually developed the key that ecologists around the world use for classifying rainforest trees. And he said to me, John, I never thought what you think until I'd been out on a field trip in the forest for 4 or 5 nights, sleeping under the stars. The 2 bottles of rum had been drunk. And I'd look up, and then I'd know why I've been doing in science what I've been doing. And often, I think the thing that takes many people into a natural science career gets lost in the objectification process. And I've actually sort of done a research project following on that, for interviewing sort of 10 elderly field scientists to explore with them the extent to which they felt their life in science enabled them to enjoy the inner journey as well as the outer. And all of them said that they felt they'd wasted many years. And they said, and that's the reason why science education in schools is not very popular. That when nature is reduced to facts and figures and diagrams and lists of specimens and cycles to be learnt and recited, then it's just natural that many students who are not keen on abstract thinking or rote learning will be turned off science. And perhaps I'll conclude with a method that I've seen used in community education and non-formal education. We often talk in the English language about the importance of education in STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering and maths. I've got a friend who says STEM doesn't work. All STEM projects do is make science better and more attractive for boys, and doesn't really reach out to the people, that is girls, migrant kids and so on, who are normally disenfranchised from science through socialisation. She said, we've got to change STEM to STEAM, S-T-E-A-M. So we've got to put art into STEM. That's why I was so pleased to see the sessions on creativity. And this friend of mine is currently running the world's largest public art project, where over 10,000 people are crocheting coral reef. Because it's turned out that the algorithm for coral is a particular form of mathematics. And so but it is the algorithm that's also used in crochet. And so having people in small study groups or social groups crocheting, you actually end up saying, well, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And so from the art, the craft, comes an understanding of the mathematics and the science and of nature conservation and coral reef conservation. This woman's name is Margaret Wertheim, W-E-R-T-H-E-I-M, and she's done a really fantastic TED talk. In fact, she's had 1.5 million views of her TED talk, and it's called The Magical Math of Coral. And it is about the integration of art into sort of cognitive learning, so converting STEM into STEAM.
Thank you, John.
Whoops.